So I just wanted, just before I started, I learned many interesting things today, but the first one I learned in the wonderful magic show from NetMotion, if anyone ever tells you again that the iPad is not a ruggedized device, that video with the guy hitting it on his head, right, shows that the iPad is clearly a ruggedized device. And then the second thing I learned, I've been to so many security conferences, but this is the first time I've ever heard the topic brought up on whether hackers are lucky in love. And I don't know the answer to that, but then I started thinking, I have a lot of friends who are kind of in the general hacking community, and they always talk about their boyfriends or girlfriends, and I've never met any of them. So I've got some emails out right now to decide whether or not these are imaginary, figments, or whether they're actually real. I'll let you know if I get an email on this soon. So today, what I'm going to do to close off the session is talk about many of the, not so much the topics that we've gone through already, but what do they mean? So you're the CIO in an organization. Mobile fundamentally changes your role, and it changes the role of the IT organization. As I mentioned to Karen, we're a software company, we're a software solutions provider, and our goal has always been to secure enterprise data wherever it lives. It could be in the app, it could be on the device, it could be in the network, it could be in the cloud. But we're not going to talk in this session at all about what MobileIron does, but rather about some of the themes that we see that are really changing the way in which IT organizations operate. And so I'm going to start with this basic concept. And my 17-year-old son just got his license, so unfortunately this is what he drives like now. By the time I get home to California, my car may or may not be intact. But I think that whenever you think of mobile, in the end, every single time that mobile brings value to any organization, it's because it takes latency out of the process. Right? You have data, you have actions that individuals want to take, and they can't take those as quickly as they want to. And so every mobile application I've ever seen that created real business value is because it took latency out of the system. But that's not just in what you build for your employees or for your customers, it's also in terms of how you have to operate as IT internally. So this is a theme we're going to come back to quite a bit. And it's not necessarily that it's always mobile. Mobile is the catalyst. And that's a nice way I find to think about mobile, which is mobile forces us to think through our organization and our technology stack more effectively so we can build a better business. So I'm going to start with theme one, which is security and privacy architecture. And there's 4 themes that we'll go through today. So clearly, much of the discussion today has been around security. And I thought it might be useful to step back for a second and chat about what the actual architectural changes are that we're referring to. And what I've found always is that mobile, from a technical and from a user requirements perspective, both are equally important. It recasts the enterprise security model. Now, the model that's up here on the left side, which is also on the big screen over there, is the model that we're all used to for the last 30 years. I have multiple agents that live on my system. I have a system image. I'm, as IT, controlling the software and patch distribution. If I'm not comfortable with the security of the network or the device, I virtualize my applications. I put them on the server. I provide a device VPN, and in the back end, I have a hardened perimeter. And this keeps things very secure in the model that we've lived in. This is a lockdown, no privacy model that's run by IT, that has a very defined data center and a very defined endpoint with limited choice, right? This is a closed stack model. That's what we had to do in order to operate in the world where we have lived. Now, what happened with mobile is that this entire architecture changed. And it's not just mobile, right? As you mentioned, it's mobile, it's cloud, many things have changed. But what are the fundamentals? So the first one is we no longer have a defined endpoint. Now we have consumer technology on the front end, as everyone talked about today, and we have multiple operating systems. We will always, from now on out, always have consumer technology as the endpoint in the enterprise. And the reason for that is pure economics. No company can economically build an enterprise-only device anymore. So in order for a device manufacturer to actually succeed, they have to be able to get success in the consumer landscape as well. So by definition, these are consumer technologies, and they've all adopted a very particular security model, which is they all have one trusted relationship, one trusted security pairing, iOS, Android, Windows, and so forth. And what this also means is that we're moving towards modern apps, as we said. But there's more changes than that. Device-wide VPN no longer is effective for many of these devices. devices, because now I have privacy considerations. So I have to think about things on a per app side, and now I've got a fabric of information that goes across my entire network. So there's many, many complexities in this, but a couple of the key points that at least I always take away with is that the model becomes very much trust-based. We know it's user-led, and you brought up the notion of identity fabric before. I think it's actually even broader. It's the information fabric. There is no such thing as a data center anymore. There's no central place of data, and so now my data is spread out across the information fabric, and I need to have a model that can support that with the elements of choice that I need. And so many of the underlying architectural assumptions that we've made in enterprise IT over the course of the past several years, the past several decades, no longer hold. Now, this is not just for iOS, Android, and Windows on the phone, it's also now for the desktop. And so this gives us, as we now enter as we're now in the second half of the year, and we start thinking about the architectures for 2016, and Windows 10 is a reality, the new versions of Android with Android for Work are a reality, it's a good chance for the architectural team within the IT organization to step back and say, what does the security architecture look like? But it can't just be the security architecture, it's also the privacy architecture. And I was having some conversations with Richard and the Mighty team before this, and this is something which is, these are two sides of the same coin. Security is an organization worried about its data being compromised. Privacy is an individual worried about his or her data being compromised. And one of the big challenges in mobile is that an IT organization, many companies, has not done a good job of communicating with the end users. And when an end user doesn't know what is happening on their device, they will always assume the worst, right? They'll fill in the gaps and they'll assume that their data is being stolen, or they're being spied on, or their personal information is being made available to the organization. And one of the things that we always find to be so helpful is for organizations to be very transparent. So transparency drives trust. And if we look at this chart here, this is actually some details, and everyone will get a copy of these, on what an employer could see if they wanted, and what they can't see even if they wanted. So if you look at where the real privacy risks and concerns are of most individuals, it's, I don't want my employer to see my personal email, my personal photos, my personal text messages, and so forth. But in an iOS system, for example, even if you wanted to, those are not things you could have access to. However, many organizations haven't done a good job of visually communicating that to their user base, and so they assume the worst. So along with the security and privacy architectures, we also need to think about what is the communication path so that the end user can absorb those and you build up a greater relationship of trust. So theme 1 was around security and privacy. Theme 2 is choice and the power of neutrality. So this is something that is a very different circumstance than many organizations have had in the past. Because in the past, the organization or the IT team had the authority to pick the applications and pick the infrastructure that the individuals in the organization would use. But those days are moving. As we all know, and there was a great data, right, that Nick showed, is if your employees are not happy with the choices you're making for them, they're going to go right around you. And that's a choice of OS, device, app, where you store the information, which cloud you use. And there's a great quote, which Nick and I both love, which is the more the CIO says no, the less secure the organization becomes. And this is a very different model, right? This is a very different model than many of us had to deal with in the past. And what it means now is we all have the challenge on how do you support the choice of best-of-breed applications within a model that's still secure. And so what I thought I might do is actually share with you at least my personal perspective on one of the major ecosystem battles that's happening out there. And how to think about it. So I want to use this as a principle first and then talk about some of the details. So there's a customer of ours, they build wallboard for houses. So they're a very traditional manufacturing organization. And the singular principle that the gentleman who runs this thinks about whenever he's deploying anything to his employees is this notion of responsible, not restrictive. And he has a very simple equation he does. And this is great. If you can do a greater than, less than analysis, then you can actually do this equation. So his notion, and I'm sharing this directly from him, is that every single individual in his organization has, of course, a consumer experience on their mobile device. Let's say he's now providing them an enterprise content experience. So that's the experience on the right-hand side, and this is the enterprise experience. It probably has a security boundary around it. And the simple question he asks himself to determine whether his users are going to use what he gave them or whether they're going to continue to use what they already had is this, which is this experience, the consumer and the enterprise, is it better? Is the enterprise experience better than the consumer experience? Is it equal to the consumer experience, or is it lesser than? And if it's lesser than the consumer experience, there's no way his employees are going to adopt it. And he can look at it himself as a consumer and decide that. Unfortunately, many of us get caught in our own trap, which is that we build something or we buy something and we say this is much better than the existing enterprise experience. But your user is not comparing it to the existing enterprise experience, they're comparing it to their consumer experience. And so the model and the bar has changed. And this ends up being quite helpful, for him at least, as one model of trying to define whether an experience is appropriate and will be adopted, or whether it'll be thrown away and he'll just have shadow IT on the back. So now I want to talk about the big battle, right? This is something that all of you are going to be right in the center of, because the days of a singular operating system are over. We're now in a consumerized landscape, and you have multiple operating systems and multiple application stacks that you need to be able to support. So my feeling is always, if you want to understand what a vendor does, any vendor, MobileIron, any vendor you work with, all you have to do is look at the economics, because economics drives behavior, right? Every vendor will follow the money. These are all for-profit companies, and we're all trying to figure out how do we create value. So what are the battles out there that are useful to keep in mind? So there's three that I want to highlight here. And these are neither good or bad. This is just the reality, and this is the reality that we live in as a software vendor who works with each of these organizations as well. So let's look at Microsoft and Google first. The fundamental battle between Microsoft and Google is for identity and productivity. So Microsoft, as Peter was just talking about, is the leader, right, in productivity solutions and identity for the enterprise. And this is an area where Google is trying to move in. And so the decisions that the two organizations make, Microsoft and Google, will be very much based on that. And it's something that you as an organization, of course, very useful to keep in mind, because this is a battleground. It's probably the single biggest battleground in enterprise computing over the course of the next 10 years. The other one is between Microsoft and Apple. And the question here is, what is the application ecosystem model? Is it an application ecosystem that's built around Office 365, or is it an application ecosystem that's built around the operating system? And there isn't a right or wrong answer for that, but they're different answers. And obviously Apple, as the operating system vendor for iOS, which in many ways is the dominant enterprise operating system for mobile in Western Europe and the States right now, they want very much for that ecosystem to be around the operating system, while other vendors who are more application-centric right now, like Microsoft, will want that to be around the application stack. So again, no right or wrong, but these are different viewpoints, and they will drive different actions. How about between Microsoft and Google? This is a battle for stickiness. So if I have an email device, if I have a mobile device and all I'm doing is email, how long does it take for me to switch from one operating system to another? About 30 seconds, right? I just configure a new device and I'm gone. And so this is something that both Apple and Google are very, very aware of. When do you get stickier as a platform? You get stickier when you have applications. And so every single platform, every single operating system provider would like their clients to build OS-specific applications, because that actually makes that platform stickier. Again, there's no great surprise here, I think, on this chart, but the key thing, and I'll tell you from our perspective, the way we look at this as a software vendor who works with all three of these players, is our ability to understand their drivers and their economics and what their long-term strategy is helps us build better software, but at the same time, from our customer's perspective, it helps our customers make better decisions, because each of these players is going to be an important player in every single enterprise architecture, right, at least for the foreseeable future. So let's now move to theme 3. I just talked about how important applications are for the viability of an operating system. But that's not the value of the application for you, right? The value of the application for you is that you're taking a business process and you're mobilizing it, and hopefully as a result of that, better things happen. But this is hard. It's hard to do. It's not hard to build the first app, the second application, but if you think about the environment that everyone's in, you have a whole host of applications, legacy applications, that you now want to modernize. So how do you do that, and what is the value of that? So I'm going to share some examples with you of what an architecture might look like. But first, some quick data and some quick thoughts. Nothing around applications matters, I believe, unless it gives you the catalyst around mobile applications, unless it gives you the catalyst to reimagine the business process. So taking an existing application and bringing it to mobile as is can work, but it's not going to add any value to your organization, right? The real value is when you reimagine it. And I wanted to share some data. So this is some statistics of our 200 largest customers. And so we have 9,000 customers. These are the 200 largest. All of these customers have more than 5,000 mobile devices deployed. 83% of them have deployed more than 100 apps to their users. And some of those could be multiple versions of an app, but that is a staggering number. So there's a direct correlation between the applications, the number of applications that companies deploy, and how broadly they deploy mobility. On one hand, that's obvious, but on the other hand, it really raises a couple of questions around how do they get there? If you're deploying 100, 500, 2,000 applications, what do you need to have in place to make that work? Here's an example. This is directly from an architectural document of one of our customers. And this particular customer is a global consumer goods company that happens to be based in the US. I believe they're the most sophisticated company in the world in really thinking through the infrastructure it takes to actually build mobile applications. And so they think about this, and I'll use this as an example, and some of this might apply to some of you, some of it might apply to others, and some of you might have, you know, a completely different take on this. But it's always useful, I think, in mobile to see what other people are doing, because there's no book, right? There's no mobile 101. There's no place that you can go and learn everything about mobile. It all happens as we do this together. The way that they structured this was the following. They went through 3 generations of mobility. The first one was a set of ad hoc applications. And some of them worked and some of them didn't. And guess what? After they wrote them, about 6 months later, they didn't know how to support them. So it's the situation that many organizations are in. In the second generation, they started thinking about scalability and sustainability and extensibility. So how do you make this program work over the long run? And they built out this framework to build what they called an app factory, had 3 components. And the goal of this was that once this was in place, whenever a business wanted an application, they could respond really quickly. That was the goal here, which is that applications could be built quickly, they wouldn't have to do rework, and they would have the same security, privacy posture throughout. So the 3 areas they looked at were, 1, what's the general mobile framework underneath? So I should have an API stack with consistent access. I should have common functions. So when applications want to grab data, when applications want to write data, I shouldn't have to recreate those methods. But that also requires me to look at the back-end systems that I have and figure out what that API stack might look like. Identity and the mobile authentication framework, absolutely fundamental. So they, like many of you, multiple different back-end systems. What is the commonality that you have to put in place so you can actually manage single sign-on across the applications that you build? Because I would argue that there's no function in your mobile application more important than sign-on and authentication. Because if you make that hard, no one even gets to the next step. And so making that absolutely simple for the user is really, really important. But that means you have to support multiple auth methods, multiple backends, and so forth. And then the third thing is they said, well, now that we have these common functions and a common authentication framework, and of course, if they were a new company, if they weren't a 200-year-old company, it'd be a lot easier because they could just start from scratch. But they're an older company, and so they have a lot of built-in infrastructure. So once I build the common services for that, I need to build a developer portal so that any business can come in with contract developers and they can build applications effectively. One of the big failure points for mobile in the enterprise has been that most people don't have application development staff. So what do? You have to contract it. But if you end up contracting it from multiple sources, how do you know what they're building? Right? Are they using the right methods? Are they building in backdoors? Not even intentionally, but by mistake, which can happen very easily. And so this notion of being able to protect the interface back in the enterprise, expose services so multiple developers can be effective, ends up being really important. So this is an example. This is a very sophisticated example. It doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but I wanted to share it as something that we've seen be effective. And you don't have to get all the way here in the first try, but even having the framework in place and thinking about what the common services are ends up being very helpful for many large organizations. The next theme is, and the last theme, is organization itself. So we've talked about security, privacy, some of the learnings there, the power of neutrality, how you think about applications and how you build frameworks. Now, what does that mean for the IT organization? So I have a theory that mobile exposes every weakness in your company. So if you want to figure out where your Wi-Fi network doesn't work, just give out 1,000 iPads. You will know in about 2 hours where your Wi-Fi network is weak, right? If you want to figure out where your IT organization does not communicate effectively, try to build an app and deploy it. And you'll immediately realize that the development team doesn't talk to the desktop team, doesn't talk to the security team, doesn't talk to whoever's managing the PKI infrastructure. And the reality for mobile is you've got to have all these things work together. So there isn't one mobile organization that works better. Every organization, I think, will rethink how mobile affects them and will try to become more agile as a result. So what I thought I would do to end this today is not so much propose a particular organization, but share with you some thoughts that tie back to what Nick said at the very beginning around maturity. So mobile maturity is similar to other types of maturity in your organization. You know that you've got to it when you feel that you have something that's sustainable, something that's long-term. And I want to share with you some criteria that we've been using, and these evolve all the time. So these are not single point-in-time criteria. They change. There's a set of criteria around business maturity. Do you have a transformative mobile strategy? Do you have leadership buy-in? Have you thought through defined business metrics when you launch a program? Is there a sustainable security privacy policy that's well understood? You can read most of these should be relatively clear from the description or from the short description. But each of these are a proxy for a level of business maturity in the organization. So I'll give you an example. You'll see the third from the bottom is ongoing employee education. If you have ongoing employee education about mobility, that's a proxy that you have put in place a sustainable program, that the education doesn't just happen when you're launching an app, but on an ongoing basis when a new version of iOS comes out, Android, Windows, that there's an educational stream and your user community knows what's happening. Same with the last one, employee satisfaction with mobile program. This is a really solid indicator of whether your business is actually driving the right level of application development in the organization. But that's not the only thing you need. You need all the business competencies. You also need the technical competencies. And these also are proxies. Do you have subject matter experts for at least 3 mobile operating systems? Have you thought through how you'll be able to access documents across mobile? Do you have an implementation framework for single sign-on? Are you doing ongoing technical education of your IT staff? This is one of the biggest challenges, which is that every IT staff feels like they're reactive. They always feel like they're behind the ball, right? Like they're being chased and they're trying to catch up. And it's so hard in mobile because mobile doesn't slow down for anyone. It moves at consumer pace, and so we're all learning to move with it. And similarly, the last bullet on here is a proxy for how well you've thought through the problems. If your employees have high satisfaction with your mobile help desk, then that means that you've thought through the employee-based end-user issues effectively. And every one of your organizations could have 20 criteria that are different than these, but we find that these tend to be pretty consistent. And these allow you, if you then evaluate them and evaluate yourself against them, to understand where you are in your journey, right? It's a journey to get to mobile. Anyone who tells you mobile's easy has never done it, right? Mobile by definition is hard because it's disruptive and it introduces new technologies, a new pace, and it lets you do things in the business that you've not been able to do before. And obviously all of us want to get started and we all want to be transformational, but many times we're stuck in different models. Sometimes I have high business competency, which I have great aspirations, but I don't have the technology competency to support it. There's other times where I'm very technically astute, but from a business perspective, I'm only working on very transactional, tactical projects. And so, of course, we all want to go from the bottom to the top right, but this is where most people are today. So very few companies are in the top right. Most companies, and this stands for large, medium, and small, the largest collection of organizations are down here, right? Are down in the bottom left. They're moving their way up, and they're learning as they go. So my belief has always been that the best learning that everyone gets is not really from those of us up here on stage, but it's from each other, because that's where all the best practices are happening. So I hope that this has been an interesting framework, at least, around a couple of these points. And I just want to leave everyone with this thought, which is that mobile and cloud are both catalysts, and we should view them as an opportunity to rethink our IT fundamentals. They're incredibly challenging at times, there's no doubt about it, but in the end, thinking them through helps us redefine a lot of the things that we've taken for granted in enterprise computing. Our information architecture, our security privacy model, our apps and process modernization, a great catalyst there, and our organizational competencies. So hopefully, if we spend the time and get this right, and invest the time and energy and work with all the folks in this room and have everyone here really share ideas with each other, we come out the other side as much more transformational businesses than we ever have been before. So thank you very much for your time.